Magic the Gathering, The Brothers' War, Artifact Cycle, Book 1, Chapter 2, Ornithopter. Tocasia did not send the boys back with Bly that trip, or for any other trip to Penregan, for the next 6 summers. Urza came to terms with Richlau, and Mishra was more careful about sitting on others' bunks. Lauren went back to Penregan and stayed away for 5 years. Bly wore out new oxen and tried to buy one of Tocasia's amulets, but to no avail. Tocasia continued to dig and to bring up the 2 boys put into her care. At first, Tocasia thought of Urza and Mishra as 2 parts of a single entity. Her inclination was reinforced by the way the 2 looked at each other before answering a question. Yet they were different people, and the desert brought out different parts of their personality. Urza became more studious, devouring every scrap of information that Tocasia had gathered on the Thran. He pored over the rosters of artifacts from previous seasons, and even the scrap heaps of metal that had been discarded. In this fashion, he found several pieces that belonged with later discoveries, but had been discarded at the time. Urza, Tocasia quickly discovered, was intrigued by the manner in which things worked. At 12, he took apart the front limbs of one of the amulets, reassembling it only after Tocasia threatened dire consequences. He and Mishra rebuilt the beast overnight, and their impromptu redesign stopped the lurching problem the machine had previously experienced. The elder brother grew lean and weary in the hot sun. His hair bleached to a straw-colored blonde, and he now gathered it in a ponytail across the back of his neck. His knowledge was encyclopedic, and his insights keen. Mishra bloomed in a dry desert air as well. While Urza burrowed through the tattered scrolls and maps, Mishra learned to dig, to sift, and to excavate. The younger brother spent more time out in the field than did his sibling. He climbed among the exposed rock faces and dry washes. Soon, he could look at the proposed excavation site and hazard a guess on how deep the excavators would have to go before striking the Thran level of artifacts. More often than not, his guess proved right. Tocasia noticed that Mishra spent more time with the other students than did his brother, and with the Amal's diggers as well. After supper, while Urza was hunched over a ligature of some skeletal artifact, Mishra was to be found at the diggers' camp, listening to the legends of the Falaji people. There were tales of raids and heroes and desert genies, of great cities captured in bottles, and hapless souls transformed into donkeys. Mishra learned of the Thran as the desert people they knew them, a race of demigods who had used their artifacts to create wonderful, terrible cities. Tocasia suspected that the diggers let Mishra sample their nabiz, the powerful fermented wine spiced with cinnamon, flavored by the Falaji, but she said nothing. It seemed good to her that Mishra had moved from beneath his brother's protective wing. Urza, for his part, seemed not to notice that his brother spent more time with the others, so wrapped up was the elder child in his studies. The work in the desert sun toughened Mishra. He was more muscular, the result of long hours at the dig site, and his flesh had a deep worker's tan. His dark hair trailed after him like a banner ornately braided in the manner of the desert. He had wider shoulders and a stauncher frame than his elder brother, and could now handle himself in any scrap without Urza's help. Both boys were tireless workers, and Tocasia saw why Bly had tried to keep them. But something more than their work bound them to her. Each of the brothers had an enthusiasm for his tasks that was contagious. Tocasia felt no need to talk to them as children. Rather, she spoke to them as trusted adults, and they returned her trust. Soon the pair were considered as vital and permanent a part of the encampment as Tocasia herself. Within 2 years, the young nobles arriving from Penregan were the same age as Urza and Mishra, and the brothers already knew the lay of the land. Remembering their own experiences, the pair sought out the protective bullies among the group and made it clear that no persecution of the smaller students would be permitted. Within another 2 years, the brothers were considered the de facto leaders of the student contingent, allowing Tocasia more time for her own examination of artifacts and their power stones. In the fall of the 2nd year, word reached the camp via Bly's caravan that Urza and Mishra's father had passed on from a long illness. The word was in a terse note, quickly penned from the boy's stepmother. The missive said nothing about an inheritance, and Tocasia suspected no mention would ever be made. She gave Urza the news first. He was working beneath Tocasia's tarp, clearing the dust from a device found earlier that day, driven from a coiled spring. Tocasia suspected it was merely a clock mechanism, but the young man had found carvings along the length of the spring itself, carvings that seemed to have a relationship to known Thran glyphs. When she told him of his father, Urza set his tools down and stared at the inlaid pearl top for a long moment. He rubbed his eyes and thanked Tocasia for the information. Then he picked his tools up again and suddenly had more intent on the device. Mishra responded very differently. When Tocasia gave him the news, he fled the dig site altogether, climbing up the side of the rocky tor above Tocasia's encampment. The old scholar thought to go after him, but Amal counseled against it. Mishra needed to work out his feelings on his own, the Falaji said. Still, after dinner, Tocasia saw Urza climbing up the outcropping, and the brothers sat up there a long time, watching the glimmer moon rise over the desert. Neither brother mentioned the incident afterwards, and Tocasia wondered what they had said to each other on that rocky tor. In the spring of the 6th year of the boy's arrival, Lauren returned, this time as an official representative of her house instead of a mere student. She had now grown as well, and was now a high-born lady, with Bly informed Tocasia with a wink and an unsubtle nod, a string of suitors desiring both her hand and her family's monies. Officially, Lauren was to survey the encampment for its recent accomplishments and to recommend if her family should increase their sponsorship of Tocasia's work. In reality, that decision could have been made back in Penregan. A growing number of young leaders of the various families had spent at least one summer working for Tocasia, and fond memories now translated into hard currency. The Argivian crown did not care for Tocasia's work, the archaeologist knew, but the Argivian crown was weak, and treated the matter as it treated everything else it did not care for. It ignored the issue. Lauren had made the long and difficult journey out to the encampment primarily to see Tocasia again, and Tocasia knew it. Most of the high manners and debutante softness disappeared by the end of the first evening, and by noon of the second day, Lauren was prowling alongside Tocasia as she moved from excavation to excavation. Tocasia had something to show Lauren, a story for her to carry back to the other former students in the Argivian capital. There had been a sudden downpour the month before, a hard-hitting desert rain that had threatened several of the dig sites. Rahad, one of Amal's diggers, had heard from a nomadic family member that the rain had hit even harder farther to the north, and flooded out an old dry wash, revealing what looked like a Thran machine. Rahad told Mishra. Mishra reported to Tocasia, and within a day, the group had mounted a small expedition north. It was a device they found, and one definitely of Thran creation. It looked at first like some sort of sailing craft, an impossibility in the desert. Long poles of ancient candlewood jutted from the exposed bank, to which had been attached to what looked like a sail rigging. Urza examined it, and then, to Tocasia's amazement, confidently declared it to be a flying craft. Something unseen in Terrashire's skies, save only in the oldest of stories. For the next week, the camp activity moved to the new site, seeking to pry loose the bird-like flying structure and haul it back to the main encampment. The diggers had to work quickly to avoid the attention of less friendly desert Falaji, as well as the predatory sand-colored rocks. The students were pressed into duty hauling dirt and clearing debris, and Urza and Mishra camped on the dig site to guard its new finds. It took only a few days to pry the device free of its surrounding soil and rock, and Urza was proven right. What Tocasia had thought of as sails were in fact wings. The construction did seem fashioned like a bird, and Tocasia dubbed it an ornithopter. Both wings were intact, though the tail assembly had been crushed. A small maze of wires and tubes at the heart of the craft cradled a now shattered power stone. They got the Ornithopter back to the camp 2 days before Lauren's arrival, and Tocasia was glad to see the look on the young noblewoman's face when she saw the tattered remains. To any other Argivian, it was a mess of fractured poles, smashed metal, and scraps of ancient fabric, but to any former student of Tocasia's, it was a treasure. To see a large device after spending a summer trying to pry fragments out of rock with a small brush made the archaeologist and her students indescribably happy. Tocasia also noticed that with the passage of time, Lauren had grown more sure of herself. She no longer hesitated to speak, nor did she spend all of her time with her old mentor. For the first few days, she hovered over Urza, who had removed the crystal housing from the Ornithopter and was busy disassembling and cleaning the small device. Then, without any warning, she suddenly switched her time and attention to Mishra, who was rebuilding the larger framework of the craft itself. Tocasia did not know what, if anything, had happened to make Lauren change her interest. Neither young man had ever mentioned her in the scholar's presence. The young woman returned to Penregan with promises of support for Tocasia and an order for light sailcloth, and the brothers returned to their work. Mishra had rebuilt the Ornithopter's framework, but the nature of the tail assembly defied him. Almost by unspoken agreement, Urza took over the reconstruction of the glider, discovering what wires went where and how they would function in flight. It was Urza who discovered that the sail-like wings had to be ribbed with thin shoots of candlewood in order to maintain their form in flight. For his part, Mishra confirmed that by bringing slender bows of snapped wing ribs back from the dig along with strands of frayed wire, Urza saw that the wire was better for controlling the shape of the wings than by mere rope, and another order was placed with Bly. The two young men spent hours together poring over the design, trying to determine how the tail assembly would function. In all, it took 8 months for the Ornithopter to be rebuilt. The key was the box of wires and discs that served as the craft's engine. Urza and Mishra, and even Tocasia, did not know exactly how the small engine could power the large Ornithopter. They only knew that it did. Urza used the small weak crystal that had belonged to the Su-Chi to power the device. It was the last day of the year, Mishra's birthday, when the craft was ready at last. The day was surprisingly warm, and a soft wind blew from the desert. There was some debate over who would get the honor, and the danger, of the first test flight. "I should do it," said Urza. "After all, I understand the workings of the power crystal cradle." "I should do it," countered Mishra. "The flight levers controlling the wings are mulish, and they need a strong hand to keep them in line." "I'm lighter," said Urza. "I'm stronger," snapped Mishra. "I'm capable of holding the levers in place," said Urza. "And I understand the power crystals as well as you do," added Mishra quickly. "I'm the elder," said Urza smugly. "And it's my birthday," shouted Mishra, the blood rising to his face, "so we are equal." Tocasia looked at the two young men and let out a deep sigh. Such disagreements were rare, but were severe enough to trouble her. At last she said, "If you cannot decide, then I will have to risk my ancient bones in this device." The two young men stared at Tocasia, then looked at each other. Each simultaneously pointed to the other and said, "He should fly it." In the end, they flipped a coin. Urza won, and Mishra did a passable job of containing his disappointment as the last preparations were made. A wide level place had been cleared outside the stockade gates for the craft. The blond young man climbed into the housing at the front of the Ornithopter and slowly depressed the two main levers, engaging the arcane crystal within the maze of gears and wheels that he had lovingly rebuilt over the past months. The entire craft trembled as the last of the slack in the wires was taken up and the wings accordioned out in a pair of great sails. The wings beat downward once, twice, and then a third time. The Ornithopter gave a small hop, and on the third beat, and Tocasia saw Mishra start as well. The younger boy said nothing. His eyes seemed transfixed by the sight, and his hands were clenched. Tocasia wondered if he was worried for his brother, or worried that his brother would damage the machine before he could have a chance to try it. The device took another short hop, then another, larger leap. Dust from the heavy beating wings blew in all directions, and the students retreated, covering their eyes and mouths from the swirling sand. One last leap, and this time the ornithopter did not come back down. It was aloft, its wings straining against the warm air. Tocasia and the other students could hear the wings sing from the strain as the small craft, like a fledgling rock leaving the nest, leapt into the air. The ornithopter climbed into the sky, and there was a sharp clatter as Urza threw the locking mechanism into place, fixing the wings into a solid gliding surface. Urza was aloft for 10 minutes. He circled the encampment twice, and there was a 10th second when the craft suddenly dropped 10 feet, but it quickly climbed again. Urza circled one last time, then set the ornithopter back down on the pad of level sand. The wings unlocked and beat as he landed. The candlewood supports groaned, but held the craft upright. Urza climbed out. "Hit some colder air," he said briefly to Tocasia. "Apparently that has some effect on its ability to keep aloft." "Let me try," said Mishra. Urza did not move away from the device. "We should check all the couplings for wear," he observed, still speaking to Tocasia, "and the struts for fractures, not to mention the integrity of the power crystal." Mishra looked at Tocasia, his face clouded. "Urza," said Tocasia softly, "let your brother use the ornithopter." Urza opened his mouth to argue, then looked at his brother and silently stepped aside. Mishra piled into the flying device. Urza leaned into the housing. "The right lever sticks, so you'll have to muscle it," he said. Mishra only grinned and shouted, "Stand away!" He flung both levers into place, engaging the wings. Urza backpedaled quickly out of the way of the huge, beating wings. Whatever sand had not been chased away before was now spun in a cyclone of wind. The ornithopter went almost straight up in a single bounce. The entire encampment could hear the sharp creaking of the candlewood struts and the high-pitched whine of the wires passing through the metal loops and pulleys. Urza grimaced as if the sound physically pained him. "It would have been better if we had waited to check out the craft before flying it again," he said to Tocasia through gritted teeth. "Better, but not wiser," returned the old scholar. Mishra climbed 100 feet, locked the wings, then focused the craft into a swooping dive over the encampment. Sheep and goats in their pens below let out frightened bleats as the ornithopter passed only a few feet above them. Mishra pulled back on the levers and re-engaged the wings, and the craft climbed again. "Do you think the craft needs a lighter pilot now?" said Tocasia. Urza shrugged. "Actually, I think there's enough pull in the wings to take 3 or 4 people aloft at once if we expand the housing." "So the argument that you should have flown it because you were lighter was disproved," pressed the old scholar, smiling as she spoke. Urza winced, but said nothing. Mishra circled the encampment twice, as Urza had before. Tocasia imagined that the lad was searching for the same spot of cold air so he could hiccup the craft as had his brother. She did notice that while Urza had concentrated on keeping the craft level, Mishra continually swooped and dove, banking in one direction, then the other. Then Mishra flew over the camp once more and headed the craft westward into the deep desert. The form of the ornithopter became a blur, then a speck on the horizon. Tocasia and Urza looked at each other. "Perhaps one of the steering wires broke," offered Tocasia. "Or the little fool wanted to see how far he could go," Urza grumbled, rushing for the rocky tor behind them to get a better view. Urza had only made it halfway up the hill when the sound of wings cutting through the warm air heralded Mishra's return. The younger brother circled the camp twice, then landed just beyond the stockade gates. By the time Mishra had touched down, Urza was waiting, his face as stern as stone. "What did you think you were doing?" he shouted as Mishra climbed out of the housing. "Bad enough that you probably overstressed the pulleys with your diving about, but to fly out of sight of the camp, you might have been attacked by rocks. If you had crashed in the desert, we might not have found you." Mishra did not seem to be listening. Instead, he said, "I saw the drawings, didn't you?" Urza was brought up short and looked at his brother puzzled. The dark-haired brother turned to Tocasia. "Out in the desert, there are drawings, mounds of dark earth against the lighter surrounding sand. We've passed them before on foot but never noticed. But from above, you can see that they're pictures. There are dragons, genies, rocks, even minotaurs." He turned to his brother. "You saw them, didn't you?" Urza blinked at his brother. Then more cautiously he replied, "I was more worried about the performance of the craft." Mishra did not bother to listen. They surrounded a large hillock. I'll bet if we check that out, we'll find some sort of old Thran encampment. It could be some Falaji holy place, started Urza, but Mishra shook his head. No, he was empathetic. There was nothing in the old tales about Falaji settlements in this immediate area. I think it's Thran, and I think we should investigate it. We should investigate the damage the flights did to the Ornithopter, said Urza, already plowing along the wings, pulling at the sailcloth and running his hands along the struts. Tocasia spread her hands in a gesture that encompassed both brothers. We should celebrate, she said. There will be enough time to do everything else in the morning. That night, students and diggers built a great bonfire in the camp and gathered around the rising flames. There was an air of excitement among the students. The young nobles had new tales to take back to Argiv. They had been present when Urza took the first flight and when Mishra found the great drawings in the desert. After long months of back-breaking work in shallow trenches and detailed cleaning of long dead bits of metal, here at last was something to be proud of. There were songs, and then the biz flowed. Rahud tried to teach several of the noble boys a traditional Falaji dance. The boys had no concept of the dance's rhythm, but since it involved waving pointed sticks, they joined in with the spirit of adventure. Mishra told and retold the story of his flight, and Tocasia knew that every young man and woman in the encampment would be clamoring for an opportunity to fly in the near future. Urza remained at the edge of the campfire, neither dancing nor drinking nor talking. Tocasia walked over to him. You enjoying yourself? Well enough, replied the youth, but I think we should check the rigging for any wear and tear. And if you put a larger housing? Tomorrow, said the old woman. You are young enough for a lot of tomorrows. Enjoy yourself this evening. I enjoy working on the devices, said Urza, watching his brother across the fire pit. The younger boy was surrounded by students as well as a few of the diggers. It seemed to Tocasia that his story grew longer and more exciting with each telling. There are other enjoyments, said Tocasia, following Urza's gaze. Your brother seems to have discovered that. The two were silent in the flickering firelight for a moment. Then Urza said, I had nothing against Mishra taking his flight. I never said you did, returned Tocasia. It's just that there's stress on any object that is put to test for the first time, continued the older brother. We should have done a full check before letting him go aloft. Of course, said Tocasia in a level tone. His own recklessness aside, he could have been hurt, said Urza. Yes, Tocasia paused, but tell that to a young man who wants to be his brother's equal. And I was only being prudent. And would you have been so prudent if you had lost the toss? Asked Tocasia. Urza did not answer, but stood watching his brother across the flames. This has been Magic the Gathering's The Brothers' War Artifact Cycle, Book 1. I will be doing other books along the way. I'll be also making other videos. So, if you like my content, go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, and check out our other videos. Bye!